the only way to get it done is to take risks, to do hard things, to win some and lose some and keep trying.
The Phil Bach Podcast. Investing, economics, entrepreneurship.
Welcome back to the podcast. Our guest is Dr. Daniel Crosby. Dr. Crosby is a psychologist and a behavioral finance expert. He's authored the books The Behavioral Investor, The Laws of Wealth, and he recently co-authored the New York Times best-selling book titled Personal Benchmark: Integrating Behavioral Finance and Investment Management. He also constructs the Irrationality Index, a sentiment measure that gauges greed and fear in the marketplace from month to month. Daniel was named one of the 12 thinkers to watch by Monster.com, a financial blogger you should be reading by AARP, and a member of the Investment News 40 Under 40. It is great to have him back on the podcast. Dan, it is great to have you on. I would say that you've got a very unique talent stack. You know, when you talk about your expertise in psychology, but also you're a writer, you're a speaker, and you're an expert in investing. You're basically an all-around trailblazer. How would you define your talent stack in your own words? And was it intentional to have so many different disciplines to play in, or was that just how things happen to have progressed?
No, I wish, in terms of how I define my talent stack, I really identify as a psychologist, right? Like, even though I work in finance and have for basically my whole career, I really identify as a psychologist. And frankly, I identify with all the trappings of being a psychologist as I speak to you today in my cozy cardigan. But I think, that a psychologist is one of the most important and one of the most narcissistic jobs you could ever hope to have. Like, the whole thought that, hey, we could spend an hour talking and you'll be healed because I imparted some wisdom on you, or I said the right things to you, is sort of a narcissistic endeavor that psychologists take on, but it's also so multifaceted. I think good psychologists are required to be Renaissance people. And so I think some of whatever I bring to the table was honed over the process of becoming a good psychologist. And some of it was frankly just born out of necessity. I started speaking not because I love it or anything. I started speaking for free just as a way to sort of advertise other services I was doing, consulting and other things. And people were always looking for speakers. And so I said, yeah, I'll come speak at your event for free and kind of give a plug for my consulting services back when I was on my own. And so, the writing, the speaking, all of it has just sort of been incidental to my pursuit of becoming a good psychologist.
Yeah. And you talked about the speaking. We met for the first time at the Wealth Stack conference a couple of years ago, and I'll never forget the image of you walking around. You had like a hat, was it like a Panama hat or something? You were wearing a seersucker suit, and you had a disposable camera. You were taking pictures. It was so awesome. It was just great. And I could see that you were very energized by the event and by, just being out there and talking to people. We're coming off a year where, for the most part, we've all been sitting at home. How have you been able to find energy sources and to keep up that momentum? I see you're so active. You're still writing constantly. You're still out there doing all this stuff. How have you been able to find energy sources during this lockdown?
So it's an interesting, is an interesting study into memory. I was not wearing a hat. There's no Panama hat involved. For a guy from Alabama, there's always going to be some seersucker involved. There was no Panama hat. I think it just shows you how we sort of put things together in our minds sometimes. The rest is all true. The Panama hat's fake news. But yes, in terms of, me, I'm really extroverted, as you correctly observed. And extroverts, it's not, extroverts in the psychological sense, it's not what we think of when we think about the colloquial usage of extroverted, which is just like whatever, talkative or outgoing. Extroversion in like the Jungian sense is people who get energy from being around other people. And so this has been a hard year for me. And I think I've had to come up with some compensatory stuff. One of them has been spending a lot of time outside, which has been really good for me. I mean, I think in my normal pre-corona life, I spent effectively no time outside. I was on a plane a bunch, I was in my office a bunch, or I would work out at a gym, and like that was it. And so I've really learned to love being outside, and I've really connected with my family in a deep and a meaningful way. Of course, we loved each other and connected before, but there's nothing like forced togetherness to make you really come together. But I think it's indicative of how we as a human race are capable of more than we think we're able to. If you would have told me, 2 or 3 years ago, hey, soon there will be a time when you won't see any of your friends, you'll be homeschooling your 3 kids for well over a year, and you're not going to go out to eat, you're not going to do anything, you're going to be stuck in your house for a year, I would have told you I was completely incapable of that. And yet it's been a fine year. Like it's been a fine year for us. And we're lucky in a lot of respects, but the psychological literature is really consistent in finding that people are capable of more than they think they are when it comes to handling loss or grief or pain. And that's certainly been the case this year.
It's amazing how, we accept a new normal. I mean, some people quicker than others, but eventually we all come to accept a new normal, like it or not. And I think we've all been forced to this year. Do you agree with that?
Well, and I'm in a very lucky, privileged position, right? Like, money's been fine. I've had a job. I have a large family that with whom I get along and that they love me. I live in Atlanta, and I read something in Atlanta magazine the other day that was talking about the increase in mental illness over lockdown. And I'm going to mess up the statistics, but I think it was like a 450% increase in calls to the suicide line. So, just as surely as like I've been okay, and it is true that people are capable of more than they think. One of the pillars of wellness from a mental health perspective is relationships. And so people who live alone, people whose primary source of interaction may have been going to work or church or other activities, I think this pandemic has not hit everyone equally. Certainly, we're seeing a greater incidence of wealth disparity than it was already terrible. It's worse now. And, I think the same thing is true of sort of mental health inequities. This thing has hit some people harder than others, and often the people that could least afford to be hit.
Yeah, it's very tragic, unfortunately. And I've observed much of that as well. But let's talk about behavioral finance. And we'll start from the top. Like, how would you define behavioral investing or behavioral finance? And as you work with financial advisors specifically, what's the core discipline that advisors can apply in their own practice and as they work with clients?
Yeah, so I define behavioral finance kind of loosely as finance that accounts for the messiness of human behavior. If you think about traditional models of econometric models, financial models, they've favored elegant mathematical models over reality, perhaps, and the messiness of the human response. And so behavioral finance is just that finance that takes human behavior into account. And I think all finance is behavioral. And I hope that behavioral finance as a discipline is eventually completely absorbed into the broader world of finance, and that we stop making what I think is a fairly artificial distinction. In terms of my work with advisors, a lot of my work with advisors is weirdly around influence. I think I sort of think of influence as the advisor's meta skill, because if you think about an advisor's day, what are they trying to do? They're trying to develop new business. They're trying to lead the people in their organization. They're trying to keep their current clients in their seat. What is business development but influencing someone to part with their hard-earned cash in exchange for your goods and services? What is leadership but persuading a group of people to pull in a common direction? And what is behavioral coaching but influencing people to set aside their fear and greed and sort of the immediacy of their emotions and do something that's in their long-term interests? So a lot of what I end up doing ends up being around sort of influence and persuasion.
That's really interesting. I mean, to what extent is that a sales function, and to what extent is that helping people navigate the markets and make better spending decisions and manage their finances in a better way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of everything. Certainly selling is the lifeblood of any company or any sort of corporate enterprise. And that is, frankly, when I talk to advisors, the thing that is always on their mind is trying to grow and get new clients. There is, of course, a natural attrition just because of people passing away or retiring or, whatever. And so it really is true that if you're not growing, you're dying. And so sales is definitely part of it. But the thing that I love about influence as this meta skill is that the principles of influence can be used from everything from me trying to get my kids to go to bed to trying to explain a concept to a client who's in over their heads with a financial product that they don't understand, to trying to get a greedy or fearful investor to do what's in their best interest. So it can't be. Influence gets kind of a bad reputation, right? Like even the mention of the word feels a little greasy. It feels like propaganda or something. But I think if you believe in what you're espousing, if you believe in what you're talking about or trying to influence, it's a natural outcropping of that belief.
Do you have concerns that some of the principles that you're teaching could be used for the dark arts way? Like, they talk about all these governments that, that try to use these nudge tactics and different things to better society. But then you have, during times of election or on social media, people can use it in more nefarious ways. Do you worry about that at all?
So, I mean, first of all, I wish people listened in my seminars enough to get that good. I wish anyone paid enough attention that they could go use this for nefarious purposes. But, that's actually my first slide in some of my presentations is, look, influence as a skill is benign. Like it's not good or bad, but your application of it has ethical and moral consequences, right? And I mean, we are living in an age where nation states and bad actors are using some of the very same concepts that I'm teaching advisors about to try and keep Mr. and Mrs. Jones in their seat long enough to live to see their retirement. These same concepts are being used by bad actors to do really terrible things to our country. And so, I mean, I think that's certainly true of influence. It's true of a lot of things. It's not good or bad. It's just the application that makes it good or evil, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier behavioral coaching. Is that you coaching financial advisors? Is that advisors coaching their clients or both? What exactly is that?
So behavioral coaching is me training the trainer, as it were, right? This is me talking to advisors about how to talk to their clients. Occasionally, I get called on to speak directly to clients, and I just don't do it that much. Most of my work is around coaching advisors to coach their clients, helping them to become sort of armchair psychologists themselves so that they can understand themselves and human nature well enough to give their clients good advice that sticks. This is, again, the influence piece. Knowing what to do and doing the right thing have, nearly nothing in common. Nearly nothing in common. Doctors and nurses smoke at a higher rate than the general population. I'm a behavioral coach and do all sorts of dumb stuff. I don't drink enough water. I overeat. It's just all kinds of stuff, right? Knowing the right thing to do and doing the right thing have almost nothing in common. And we see this all over the place. We see that only about half of people who get sick go to the doctor. And among the half that go to the doctor, less than half take their medicine as prescribed. So, we live in this world full of all these miraculous solutions that we're not availing ourselves of to the fullest extent because of human problems, these sort of last mile problems. And even coronavirus, right? We hear we have this, vaccine that for all outward appearances seems to be very miraculous and to be really the thing we've been waiting for. And then you see in surveys of behavior that a very large proportion of people in the US just are not going to take it for one reason or another. And this is emblematic of a million societal problems where we have sort of a technical cure, but a behavioral problem means that the technical solution kind of eludes us.
One of the things that you recently wrote about was the science of likability. And I love this post because I could not tell you with a gun to my head if I meet someone and instantly like them or don't like them, why, right? What was it about that person that rubbed you the wrong way? I don't know. So it's interesting. Tell us about that. What is the science of likability?
So this wasn't part of that post, but I'll sort of lead with this. The best predictor of likability is how like us another person is. And that is like so sad and petty as a human race that like when we meet someone, when you or I meet someone and we're like, man, that Phil is a great guy. It usually means that you and I just have a lot in common, right? We just kind of see the world similarly, and it's sort of just self-reinforcing. We see someone who shares our ideas, our way of dressing, our way of talking, our way of thinking, and we go, I don't know, there's just something about that guy, and he's really cool, and it's just sort of like a twisted form of self-love. So one of the things, when we're talking about influence, one of the things that you can do when you're meeting someone, if you want to do business with them, is you can emphasize points of commonality. You can just really sort of draw out like, hey, we like the same sports team, or, look, you got 3 kids, I got 3 kids. But beyond that, we like people who share a couple of common traits. We like people who are attractive. We like people who make jokes, who are funny. We like people who compliment us. And we like people with whom we share a common struggle. So I'll talk about each of those for a second. The attractiveness thing is, the psychological literature has a pretty expansive view of what constitutes attractiveness. It doesn't mean you have to be, Brad Pitt. It just means you're sort of, well-dressed, well-groomed, well put together. The humor piece, I think, is obvious. You see a lot of podcasts or presentations that begin or end with a joke, because I think good presenters kind of intuit the humor piece works. The sharing a common struggle one, I think, is the one that is most overlooked. I think many of us were sort of taught, if you don't have something nice to say, not to say anything at all. But if you find someone who has overcome some things that you have overcome as well, or is going through some things that you find yourself in the midst of, that's a real point of sort of relational social glue. And then the funny part about compliments that always makes me laugh is the literature says that we like people who pay us compliments whether or not they're sincere. So there's there's research that shows that even when people feel like they're kind of being snowed, like brown nosed or kissed up to, it's like, no, we still love that, even if it feels a little inauthentic. So don't be inauthentic with people, but compliments do work whether or not they're sincere.
That's amazing. Well, another thing that you've written about is overcoming fear. And I really like this one because fear holds us back in so many ways, obviously. And if you're able to remove fear, it just lifts the limits of what you can do of becoming your best self. And I know that because I went through a transformation, had a major health issue several years ago, required 2 major surgeries, at a pituitary tumor that was up pressing on the brain. And going through that experience, I came out of it. I didn't know it at the time, but now looking back, going through that experience really removed a lot of the fear I had with the everyday things in life, going out and starting a company or doing media or different things that I've done. I don't think I would have been able to do without having that experience and coming out of it and transforming in the ways that I did, which primarily were, stop being afraid, take that out of the equation and live life like it could be taken from you tomorrow, because it can. And it's something that a lot of people who have had those types of experiences talk about. And a lot of people who haven't, I think, tend to roll their eyes, and it just kind of sounds like a little cheesy, a little corny and all that. But, having experienced it, it's such a true and impactful thing that people can have on their lives. So, tell us a little bit about that, about overcoming fear and how to do it and why it's so important.
So the thing that you talked about, the fancy shrink term for this sort of brush with impermanence, is an existential boundary experience, right? So you have this moment where you realize that nothing's guaranteed, life is short, so like you might as well kind of go ahead and take the plunge. And so one of my favorite authors and philosophers was asked like how people could live better lives. And he said, spend more time in graveyards, basically reflecting on the fact that nothing's guaranteed and none of us are here for that long. My mom was petrified of flying on a plane until 9/11 happened. And that's weird to say that my mom got more comfortable flying on a plane post 9/11. I know that was certainly not everyone's experience, but for her, 9/11 was such sort of an improbable black swan out of the blue sort of experience that it was just sort of jarred this realization in her that like, look, anything can happen at any time and any place. And so she sort of, succumbed to the irregularity and the randomness of life and said, what the heck? Like, I'm just going to get on a plane. I'm not going to let it stop me. So the first thing you can do with fear is what you did, and you can learn from it. So fear is there to teach us. Like everything we go through, every emotion that we have is there to teach us. When researchers look at something like depression, which doesn't impact the rest of the animal kingdom the way that it does humankind, even something like depression has an evolutionary root. It's there for us to ruminate on something bad so it doesn't happen again. I mean, the reason sort of the depressive mind works the way it does is for us to visit and revisit the bad thing that happened so we can hopefully learn and grow from it. Now, that certainly gets out of whack sometimes and becomes clinical and to the point where we need medicine or treatment. But as a general principle, that's how depression works, and that's how fear works. Fear has lessons to teach us, right? Sometimes the lesson is take less risk. Sometimes the lesson is take more risk. So I think if people can embrace fear as an emotion with something to teach us, that's a great place to start. And I think the second thing is when you look at the way that simple phobias, so this is like the shrink term for something like arachnophobia, right? Or aerophobia, fear of heights. When you look at something like a simple phobia, the way that a psychologist like myself would treat it is through gradual exposure. So if Phil is scared of spiders, he comes into my office and the first thing that we do is we talk about spiders for 10 minutes. In the next session, we talk about spiders for 20 minutes till we can work up to talking about spiders for 50 minutes, right? And then I have you, look at a picture of a spider. And then I have you hold a plastic spider. And I just I step you up the fear ladder until finally, Phil and I take a field trip and he's holding a tarantula in each hand or whatever, right? Whatever the case, it's gradual exposure. And there's a lot that we can learn from that in elsewhere in life, in sort of less concrete or less literal fears, is that the way to tackle a fear is bit by bit. When we turn away from a fear, we're actually feeding it. We're legitimizing or reifying the fear and saying, yep, that's right. That really is as bad as you thought. And when we actually turn toward it, and engage it in measured ways, it's only then that the fear starts to dissipate.
That's really interesting. I never would have looked at it that way. Certainly not the fear that I had in mind, which is the limiting fear, the fears of maybe I'm not capable of this or that, or the fear that holds us back from going out and taking big risks that ultimately are the things that define our lives.
Well, when you think about the fear you mentioned, which is, I think, very, very common. If you have a fear of taking a risk, like an entrepreneurial risk or, a risk to do something you love that has some downside, every day you don't take that risk is a vote for, yep, that's just as scary as I thought, right? And, behavior and cognition reinforce each other, right? We used to think that people would smile when they're happy, but now we know that works in reverse too, that if you make someone smile, right? If you sort of force the behavior, people become happier. And so behavior and, actions and behavior work in tandem to sort of create this world. So sometimes the thing you have to do to overcome a fear is literally just to fake it till you make it, to just take some small risk and break that cycle of voting for the fear being as scary as you thought it was.
Wow. Yeah. And that can really work. I want to talk a little bit about self-esteem. There was something you said on a podcast we recorded a couple of years ago for the ETF experience, and I want to revisit it because I just loved it so much. You said the only way to get self-esteem is to take risk, do hard things, and come out the other side. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I think you and I are roughly the same age, and we are of this, sort of gold star generation. And we grew up with folks thinking that our teachers and our parents, well-meaning as they were, thought that the way to get us to do something in life was to sort of lavish us with praise. And you hear about the participation trophies and all that. But that really was a movement. I mean, this self-esteem movement really was a movement, I think in the late 70s, early 80s and 90s. And what they found was that lavishing people with self-esteem, it didn't work. And that self-esteem levels, sort of self-reported self-esteem levels, were predictive of nothing. They weren't predictive. They weren't predictive of success. They weren't predictive of teen pregnancy, likelihood to offend and go to jail, like any kind of societal outcome you want to measure. It just wasn't predictive of anything. And there was this whole sort of pop psychology literature that emerged around it that inflated it in the absence of any sort of real empirical data. And when they did a meta-analysis, like a study of all the studies on self-esteem, they found that there was just no there. And so what they found is that people are really, people are smart, and people have a sixth sense for being patronized or being lied to. And so if a kid is struggling in class and he knows he's struggling, and you're sitting there going, no, Daniel, you're smart, you're great, you're wonderful, you're doing great, that kid knows that's false. And so really the only thing that truly predicts anything and truly builds any kind of lasting and legitimate self-esteem is, going back to our fear conversation, taking these incremental risks, winning some, losing some, learning, getting back on the horse and getting better. When we look at models of happiness, the reigning model of happiness came out of the University of Pennsylvania, and it's called the Perma Model, and each PERMA is an acronym. And the A in PERMA is for achievement. It's a very human tendency to want to be better today than we were yesterday. And if we're not getting better, it doesn't matter how many parents or teachers or coaches tell us that we're, a beautiful ray of sunshine. It doesn't stick, and it doesn't last, and it doesn't really sink into our hearts. So the only way to get it done is to take risks, to do hard things, to win some and lose some, and keep trying.
Yeah, and a lot of that is kind of similar to when you burst on the scene with a TED Talk, you are not that great. And, some of that is kind of along the same lines. What was that, initial thesis that you had when you developed that first TED Talk?
Yeah, you're not that great was my first TED Talk. I've done 3 TED Talks, each less popular than the one previous. So I'm just getting worse and worse. I'm just getting worse and worse at it. So yeah, that first one was kind of a big hit. And it was really came from examining my own life, right? Because when I was a kid, again, growing up in this gold star generation, I was academically successful. I was praised by all my teachers. And I was told, that I was smart and that I was special and that I was different and that I was gifted and, all these things. And when school started to get hard, in middle school and high school, what I did was just give up, right? Because once you've been crowned with this sort of bad word choice, this crown of specialness, once you've been crowned with this crown of specialness, you don't want to risk, right? Like you don't want to do anything that will disprove people's thesis that you're smart and special and gifted. And so I just didn't take risks. I didn't work hard because I thought, look, I'm preternaturally gifted. And if things aren't clicking for me, something's wrong with the system, not with me. So I blamed externalities. I sucked at school. I didn't try at baseball and, things that I loved. Anytime things got hard, I quit. And this is really a phenomenon that happened to a lot of kids who are sort of labeled special early on, that if they're not taught work ethic, if they're not praised for being hardworking, things don't go their way. And so Carol Dweck, the psychologist, has done a lot of great research on this in the New York City public school system. And, she's done research that materially impacts the way that I parent my children, which is, you should be complimenting your children and encouraging your children to work hard and play by the rules and be consistent, because these are the things that are predictive of long-term sort of adult success. People who are praised for being innately special, the research shows they cheat more, they fail more, they give up easily, the way that I did when I was a kid. And so that "you're not that great" talk was basically just a nod to some of these counterintuitive truths that, telling people they're special is actually one of the greatest disservices you could do for especially a child.
Yeah. All right. I want to change gears a little bit here and talk about your writing process from a technical standpoint. What is your process to sit there and get all these ideas and research and everything you do to get it down on paper? And I have a selfish motive for asking this question, which is, I'll ask it as like a 1A here, which is, should I write a book?
Yeah. Oh, I'm excited. This is one of my favorite soapboxes. So first, to my writing process, it begins with a question, right? So I, like with my latest book, I wanted to answer, what are the psychological, physiological, and societal variables that impinge on good investment decision making? So, it begins with a question. The next thing I do is I devour all the research I can find, trying to find the end of the internet. I don't know if you've ever researched a subject until it sort of starts to fold back on itself and everything is cross-referencing stuff you've already read. But it's like you just research the universe of data that would help you answer that question. And when I begin this research process, I take handwritten notes because themes start to emerge. This is one of the sort of the hallmarks of my personal intellectual journey, is just looking for themes that simplify complex problems. So I start with a question, I read everything I can on it, I see what pillars start to emerge, and then I outline the book around those pillars. So my outlines are crazy. I outline it almost to the page. It's not even worth calling an outline at that point. It's so detailed. And then what I do is I write 2 to 5 pages a day. I learned early on in my writing process to never write more than 5 pages a day because the quality would just really start to suffer. So I try and take, this outline, let's say this outline has, 75 or 100 sort of sub bullets. I take one of those bullets a day and I knock it out. So people ask me how long did it take you to write your book? And in some ways the answer is, 3 months or, 3 or 4 months, because from outline to finished book, it takes about 3 or 4 months. But the more honest answer is a couple of years, because the process of forming the question, exploring the question, outlining the question, finding these pillars, that takes a long time. So that's my writing process.
Right. I could see that. The stuff I've written is mostly just, blogs and shorter form stuff, but I write very infrequently when I really, when I have something that I have to say, something that's been bubbling up, or when I just, have some specific inspiration. But what I find is I'm pulling things that I've been thinking about or, have jotted down somewhere for the past 6 months, and they all come out. The writing of the blog, let's say like a 3-page blog, would take me about 2 hours, but it's got pent up ideas and thoughts and things that I've referenced going back months and months and months.
Yeah, there's this great Picasso anecdote where he's sketching in a park and a woman who's a fan of his comes up to him and says, to the great artist, hey, I'm a huge fan. Would you sketch me? And he draws, he takes 5 minutes and does a little pencil sketch of her. And she says, what do I owe you? And he quotes her some enormous number. And, she says, what in the world? Like, it took you 5 minutes. And he goes, no, it took me my whole life. Right. And so that's kind of how I think about writing as well. Like, maybe the physical writing of a book takes 4 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years. But I think the process of writing a book, a good book, is the byproduct of a lifetime spent searching. So I know you're of that mindset anyway. So should you write a book? I think it depends on what your motivation is. Writing a book is the most satisfying and least profitable thing you'll ever do. This week, I've gotten contacted, emails from 3 different countries in Europe where people have read my book and had nice things to say about it. That is the absolute best. That is just, I can't even describe. It's absolutely the most gratifying thing for me professionally to know that people around the country and around the world are writing things that I have written and are being impacted by my ideas. And then at the same token, every time my residuals come in, I just laugh because it's so terrible. And I mean, I've been lucky. My books have sold well. And even still, it's not great. So if you do it for the love of the game and you do it to clarify your thinking, that for me is the biggest thing I get out of it selfishly, is I clarify my own thinking around a subject. So if you want to clarify your thinking, if you want to connect with like-minded, interested people all over the world, write a book. If you want to make money, there's a lot better ways you could spend that time.
All right. I mean, not being overly motivated by money myself relative to everything else. But, the idea of punching out 200 to 300 pages is so daunting and intimidating. It's just, the idea of staring at a blank Word document saying, all right, I'm going to fill up an entire book of material is just incredibly intimidating. But I guess like everything else, you start with the first step.
Well, and that's where the outline comes in. I could do none of this stuff. I would be so overwhelmed by that blank page if I didn't have the outline. Like, once you've outlined it to literally 50 or 100 sort of sub points, it really comes down to writing 100 blog posts, which is a different animal than writing. You could write a blog post every 3 days this year. Like, if I ask you, hey, Phil, could you write a blog post every day? Every couple of days, could you write a 1-page blog post? You'd go, yeah, that's fine. That's a reasonable request. But the thought of writing a 300-page book is so enormous and so daunting. So the preparation is the only thing that makes it, manageable at all.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, I'm laying down a marker now. I'm going to get as far as the outline in 2021, which it sounds like is a big part of the battle. So that's I'm putting that out there here publicly. Love it. Perfect place to leave it off. Dan, thank you so much. Where can people find more of your writing, your books, everything else that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm a contributor. I'll be writing for Orion Advisor Solutions going forward. So check there. Write on the Brinker Capital blog. In terms of me personally, I'm very active on LinkedIn and Twitter. So at Daniel Crosby on Twitter and Daniel Crosby, PhD on LinkedIn.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to our audience for your time and attention. We'll be back with a new show soon.